Good afternoon, and welcome again to the Murphy Institute series of faculty webinars. My name is Greg Sisk, a co-director of the Murphy Institute. This is another in our continuing series to highlight our University of St. Thomas faculty. In addition to more formal conferences promoting the mission of the Murphy Institute, this faculty series continues throughout the academic year, with diverse members of our university faculty addressing such issues as the meaning of work, religious liberty, racial equity, and building a community. Now, our primary speaker will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will invite questions. The question and answer link on your Zoom page is the way to send questions to me as the host. And then I will choose as many of the most common questions as possible before we conclude in about an hour. Today's speaker is Carl Warren, who is a professor at the University of St. Thomas Law School. He directs our law school's Community Justice Project, a clinic in which student attorneys investigate community-wide social justice issues and then develop and implement policymaking solutions, usually working in collaboration with community-based partners. A graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School, Professor Warren has served as a trial attorney in human rights enforcement with the Minnesota Attorney General's office and as a member of the clinical faculty at the University of Minnesota Law School. Professor Warren has taught and been a frequent speaker on issues concerning race, civil rights, and the impact of bias on perception, judgment, and the administration of law, of justice and the practice of law. Today, Professor Warren will be talking with us about the difficulty of changing hearts and minds, coming to grips with the consequences of adverse stereotypes. Welcome, Professor Warren.
Hello, Professor Sisk, and hello to everybody who's out there in cyberspace. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak with you today. I'm going to use a PowerPoint. Let me share my screen. Of course not. Okay. Not a second here. Okay. Come on. Okay. And you know, it's something when I think about the fact that perhaps a good 9 months ago, I never would have envisioned myself dealing with all the technology that's been necessary to use in this pandemic time. But thank goodness for technology. Yes, the topic that I wanted to talk about today is the difficulty of changing hearts and minds, coming to grips with the consequences of adverse stereotypes. You know, anytime we're talking about race, you know, it's hard. It's very hard. It's very hard to talk about it. It's very hard to listen to discussions about it. But especially during these times of intense polarization within our society, you know, how do you come together to talk about race? Do you remember the Kilauea volcano eruption on Big Island in Hawaii in May of 2018? Its explosion sent a plume of ash 30,000 feet into the air, causing it to rain down and cover the surrounding area. Fissures opened along the volcano, sending rivers of molten lava flowing down, destroying everything in its path, including 700 homes. In addition to hot lava, the fissures spewed gas and toxic plumes into the air. I remember looking at the pictures of these fissures and thinking that they were a perfect metaphor for the deep fissures of division that have opened within our society and are spewing toxic communications in the form of baseless accusations, demeaning characterizations, and disinformation, as well as a constant flow of distrust and hatred that destroys whatever prospects of civility are in our paths. So I ran across this quote, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. I found that this quote is particularly apropos to the situation that we find ourselves in today. And it was actually something that Abraham Lincoln said in his annual message to the Congress sent back in December of 1862. Now, this was while we were in the midst of the Civil War, and it was 1 month before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. I actually looked up in a dictionary the definition for disenthrall. I hadn't heard of it before, but it means to set free, to release, to let go, to extricate, to unshackle, unchain, to emancipate. And it refers to our being able to do this for ourselves, to set ourselves free, to let go of things that are keeping us so constricted, to unshackle ourselves, to unchain ourselves, to emancipate our minds. Leonard Steinhorn and Barbara Diggs Brown, they published a book entitled By the Color of Our Skin, The Illusion of Integration and the Reality of Race. They were both on the faculty of American University School of Communication. Diggs Brown is Black and Steinhorn is white. Both are self-described, disillusioned integrationists. They maintain that racial integration should not be confused with desegregation, that integration is the realm of life that's governed by behavior and choice, not by statutes and institutions. Whereas this desegregation means the elimination of discriminatory laws and barriers to full participation in American life. Steinhorn and Diggs Brown said that what makes racial integration so compelling is that it is about people, not laws. It is about the way we perceive each other, about the way we act toward each other, about whether there will ever be room in our hearts, homes, classrooms, and communities to welcome each other comfortably as neighbors and friends. They describe a racially integrated America as one in which Blacks and whites would choose to live side by side, socialize with ease, see each other as peers, recommend each other for jobs, harbor little mutual distrust, respect each other's outlook, and appreciate each other's contributions to American culture. While overwhelming economic and social justice disparities persist, progress has been made in removing some of the legal barriers that support segregation. But concerning integration, where the barriers are behavioral, social, residential, and psychological, Steinhorn and Diggs Brown maintain that Blacks and whites are not much closer to living together, learning together, relaxing together, praying together, and playing together than they were a generation ago. And their book was written in 1999, so we can add another generation on to that disparity. Steinhorn and Diggs Brown assert that while desegregation may unlock doors, integration is supposed to open minds. Integration is not governed by laws and institutions. It is governed by choices made in one's heart and mind. So how do we change hearts and minds? One obstacle is stereotypes. The Penguin Dictionary of Psychology defines the term stereotype to mean a set of relatively fixed, simplistic overgeneralizations about a group or class of people. Here, negative, unfavorable characteristics are emphasized. James M. Jones, in his book Prejudice and Racism, created a list of problems created by stereotypes. Stereotypes are factually incorrect. They are illogical in origin. They are based on prejudice. Those who hold stereotypes are irrationally resistant to new information that contradicts the stereotypes that they hold. They exaggerate group differences. They are ethnocentric. They imply generic origins of group differences. They underestimate outgroup variability. They lead people to ignore individual differences. They are based on perception. They lead to biased perceptions of individuals, and they create self-fulfilling prophecies. When you think about such things as the inconceivable horrors of slavery, the demeaning, debilitating laws establishing and reinforcing segregation that were crafted during the Jim Crow era, and the thousands of African Americans who were lynched from 1877 to the mid-1960s, or when you think about the disproportionate mass incarceration of African Americans, or the incapacitating, life-threatening collateral consequences of having a criminal record as a result of racial profiling, you have to ask yourself, how can a society engage in such inhumane oppression and still believe itself to be good? I believe that part of that answer lies in the powerful adverse stereotypes that were created, promoted, and accepted as truth by those in the mainstream to rationalize and justify the inhumanity of the historic and continuing oppression. We need to examine these stereotypes and their sources and perpetuators. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the development of these stereotypes began when Black African slaves were first brought to North America in the 1500s. This process has occurred over centuries. It's like the programming of the conscience of our society. So looking back to what was being written, what was being discussed, what was being created back during slavery, to justify its practice, African Americans were negatively characterized as naturally immature, lazy, unintelligent, drunken, criminal, and licentious. Writers often depicted Blacks as animals, cannibals, or debased humans. Black men were stereotyped as hypersexual and hyperaggressive, almost wholly subservient to the sexual instinct. It was maintained. Thomas Reed Roots Cobb, a leader in the Georgia Bar and a key figure in the drafting of the Confederate Constitution, wrote, "Lust is his strongest passion, and hence rape is an offense of too frequent occurrence. Fidelity to the marriage relation they do not understand and do not expect." Others wrote, when these sex-crazed conceptualizations of Black men juxtapose themselves against the countervailing conceptualizations of white women as pure and docile, the deadly taboo was conceived that provided a further justification for increased oppression and killing of Black men. Just a look in the eyes or an alleged wolf whistle, as was the case with Emmett Till, could be enough to get a Black man killed. Another thing to keep in mind is that these weren't just rumors or musings expressed in secret. They were being presented by the leaders in society, the leaders in academics, politics, science, and the church. George McDuffie, who was the Democratic governor of South Carolina, in a presentation to the South Carolina legislature, maintained that no human institution is more manifestly consistent with the will of God than domestic slavery, and no one of his ordinances is written in more legible characters than that which consigns the African race to this condition as more conducive to their own happiness than any other. And these were some of the verses in the Bible that were cherry-picked and touted as proof that slavery was consistent with the will of God. I believe this to be the will of God. Governor McDuffie also asserted that African Americans have all the qualities that fit them for slaves, and not one of those that would fit them to be freed men. Thomas Reed Roots Cobb put forth what he purported to be proof that African Americans were anatomically suited for the physical requirements of slavery. Mr. Cobb opined in his book that Negro slaves lacked judgment, and as a result, cannot comprehend as to execute the simplest orders. They are imitative, never inventive. What they have seen another do, they can do also, and practice will make them perfect in its execution, but the discovery of a better, easier, cheaper process never engage their thoughts. Mr. Cobb went so far as to maintain that slavery so far from retarding the Negro race has advanced it, and that by means of this institution, the knowledge of God and his religion has been brought home with practical effect to a greater number of heathens than by all the combined missionary efforts of the Christian world. He warned that if you removed the restraining and controlling power of the master, the Negro would become at once a slave of his lusts. When you think about that, this was the prevailing notions of the day, you can understand the impact that these characterizations were having upon the thoughts, the minds, the consciences of the nation. Even our founding fathers were not immune. George Washington expressed his dilemma as to what to do with his slaves, stating that they might prove to be a very troublesome species of property. One of the heroes of our democracy, Thomas Jefferson, in his writings, described Blacks as lacking imagination, reason, forethought, and talent in poetry, art, oratory, and science. He said, their griefs are transient, their love more like lust, lacking a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Then, of course, there's a decision by the US Supreme Court in Dred Scott v. Sanford, in which the court described Negroes as being an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the right race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. Of course, the US Supreme Court in Dred Scott ruled that a Negro, whether slave or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore had no standing to use the federal courts. This was a pronouncement from the highest court in the land. You know, and of course, the institution of slavery came to North America at its inception and was in operation for about 200 years before the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, were penned. So it's only natural that the Constitution would incorporate the concept. Here is the provision that determined how to apportion representatives among the states. The Constitution counted slaves as being 3/5 of a person. And of course, there's the Fugitive Slave Clause, Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3, which provided that no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in the consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. You know, if you try to put yourself in the shoes of a slave within the United States at that time, and it's, you know, there's no way you could actually experience or envision what that meant. But just the fact that there is no place that you could run, no place that you could hide, the horror, the ongoing nightmare of your existence, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to fathom. This is a brochure that was posted around Boston after the Fugitive Slave Clause was enacted and its relative statutory provisions, in which it was warning the African American citizens of Boston to avoid the police and the watchmen, which is like a neighborhood watch group, because they had been empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, not only of slaves, but also of freed persons who were sent south into slavery as a result. So if words were not enough, the media of the day, excuse me, the media of the day, marketing and the arts reinforce the demeaning characterizations of African American people and their products. I remember seeing artifacts and ads like these when I was growing up in the 50s. Now, some of these images never went away. You'll recall very recently, like within a few weeks ago, the Aunt Jemima brand is just now being retired by Quaker in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. Company officials acknowledged when they made this decision that it had its roots, the brand had its roots in stereotypes. Stephen Fetchit and Hattie Daniel from Gone with the Wind fame. You know, it's kind of bittersweet. On the one hand, they opened doors for all the generations of Black actors who succeeded them. But in order to do so, they had to become subservient to the stereotypes because it was very important. In fact, it was required that African Americans act consistent with the stereotypes. If you did not, that the results could be deadly. So yes, Stephen Fetchit and Hattie McDonald did open doors, but in order to do so, they had to debase themselves. And Hattie McDaniel was the first African American to receive an Oscar. Okay, so this is a timeline that I created for a project a number of years ago. And it takes up three 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. And each sheet covers about 150 years. And so when you look at the first sheet, you see that things like African-American slaves being brought to Spanish Florida in 1565, African-American slaves being brought to Jamestown Colony in 1619. If you move on to the next 150 years or so, you see such things as the Declaration of Independence. Again, 200 years after the first slaves set foot on this continent. Declaration of Independence in 1776, the U.S. Constitution adopted in 1787. 1790, there were 600,000 slaves in the South and 97,624 in the North. Then you see that by 1830, the number of slaves in the South had increased to 2 million, 5,475, and down to 3,568 in the North. You also see in 1856, the Dred Scott decision and the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, among other things. When you go on to the third, final page, in this timeline, at the time I did it, I stopped in 1999. But you see all the things that happened. The Civil War from 1861 to 65, Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, jumping down to the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. Now, I was born in 1950. So just under the second half of this page was everything that occurred during my life. So you have the Brown v. Board of Education decision, Emmett Till being lynched, Rosa Parks refusing to move to the back of the bus, JFK being elected, JFK being killed in 1962, 1963, the I Have a Dream speech, 1968, Martin Luther King being killed. 1991, Rodney King being beaten. 92, the police being acquitted, sparking the LA riots. This just drives home to me how recent the civil rights movement was. No wonder the adverse stereotypes persist today. In the eye of history, it's just a blink of the eye. This is all so recent. I mean, we can pass laws prohibiting slavery and other horrendous acts, and we should. But there are so many areas that the laws cannot touch. These are matters of the heart. Who does one choose to live next to? Who does one choose to socialize with? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Now, this was the April 2008 cover of Vogue magazine. It looks like a fun photo shoot. You have LeBron James and supermodel Giselle. But when you look at what it is based on, you realize that it is capitalizing on a trigger to the stereotype with LeBron as the wild gorilla, King Kong, and Giselle as the Fay Ray damsel in distress. What a way to sell products. Back following the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Darren Wilson, the police officer who killed him, gave testimony grand jury, okay, excuse me. The term escaped me for a moment. He gave testimony at the grand jury proceedings. And one of the things that he said was during the struggle that took place in his car, he said, Michael Brown looked up at him and had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. So what influence did the stereotype play in the fear that enhanced the sense of threat to the officer? Officer Brown, by the way, was not charged. Of course, it was Eric Garner. Who died after being put in a chokehold, even though he was calling out that he could not breathe. By the way, he was suspected of selling individual untaxed cigarettes. Of course, there's Philando Castile. He was pulled over in Falcon Heights because of a broken taillight. In 13 years, he had been pulled over 49 times because of minor infractions. He was shot and killed by a police officer after he told the officer that he had a license to carry a firearm and that he was carrying. He was shot as he reached for his ID. If you haven't seen the dash cam video, I mean, I know that we've probably all seen the video that was shot by his girlfriend with her as she live streamed the encounter from the car, the one that shows Philando shot. But if you haven't seen the dash cam video from the police car, you should. You can hear the conversation that took place, the tone leading up to the shooting, and you can draw your own conclusions. The police officer, Yanez, was charged with manslaughter and reckless discharge of a firearm. He was tried but acquitted. A key question in the trial was whether Yanez had a reasonable belief and fear that Castillo was going to use his gun. Yanez testified that he was scared to death. It makes you wonder to what extent, if at all, the police officer's fear was enhanced by the stereotype concerning the danger of a Black man with a gun. Tamir Rice, this was a 12-year-old who was playing with a toy gun in the park. Someone called it in, and a police officer arrived, and within a few seconds of his arrival, shot and killed Tamir. Of course, there's George Floyd. This is a listing of some of the African Americans who have been killed as a result of use of deadly force by police officers, most of whom were unarmed, and the list stops. When I made it, I went through Philando Castillo in 2016, but there have been many since. You've all heard, oops, I guess I don't, missing a slide. Basically, it's a dog whistle politics. It's a term that we've come to understand. And basically, it refers to the practice of some politicians of using words or terms that are triggers to the stereotype and the emotions that the stereotypes conjure up within a person. So, like Michael Dukakis, who was a presidential candidate in 1988, going up against Mr. Bush Sr., was ahead in all the polls until the opposition ran an ad that talked about a prison release program where prisoners could have opportunity to get out of prison for a weekend or whatever in return. And Willie Horton, a prisoner who was on furlough, assaulted, raped a white couple, and this was brought up, and which had an adverse impact on Dukakis's campaign, and was believed to be a major reason why he lost. And there are many other examples of politicians using dog whistle tactics. So Ryan Massigal is a professor of theology and social ethics at Fordham University. He wrote an article in 2017 in which he maintained that racism is a sickness of the soul, that we have built a whole society on an illusion, a delusion, a lie. That's what stereotypes are. That some count and others do not. This is a lie. That some lives are more disposable than others.
that people with lighter skin matter more than those with darker skin. Massigal states that it is high time for us to awake and to come to our senses. He states that more is needed than simply seeking to improve, since more often than not, a resolution to improve does not involve a genuine commitment to change. In fact, this may be part of the reason why studies are finding that basic implicit bias training does not have long-term impact. According to Massigal, to heal the soul, we must change. We must become more. We must become the person we were meant to be, our true selves, with a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new way of loving, a new way of living. What Massigal describes as a spiritual transformation. Indeed, a transformation of this scale is needed to truly change one's heart and mind. We must develop an awareness of what is really going on. We can't assume that what we perceive and experience as reality is a reality that is being experienced by others. We can't assume that the options and freedoms that we have in life are available to others. But most importantly, and without this, nothing else works. We have to have a personal stake. We have to have skin in the game. We have to realize that no, we're not just trying to help someone with the difficulties in their life. We have to understand that their difficulties are our difficulties as well. There's the old saying that the strength of society is measured by how it treats its poor, its marginalized. That is true. We have to understand that the adverse impact of discrimination being experienced by someone else is an adverse impact to ourselves. So another musing as to who said what. The quote is, "It is when things are at their worst that you actually have the best chance to succeed." And you could spend a lot of time thinking about this one, but I'll tell you, you'll never guess, because the person who said it was not a nationally known figure. It was an old pastor from my past. He used to say this all the time. It is when things are at their worst that you actually have the best chance to succeed. And I think that's true, because we as people are at this point at various times, and we're certainly at it now. But in this situation, when things are at their worst, it becomes clear. What's at stake becomes clear. What decisions need to be made and what the likely consequences will be, depending on what we decide, is clear as well. All the cards are on the table. I often remind myself that for those of us who love history, that when we read about history, we know how things turned out. Sometimes I think about how anxious it must have been for people going through things like the Civil War or World War II, not knowing how it was going to turn out. Well, I think we are in a situation like that today, with the pandemic, with the economic displacement, with the intense divisions within our society. We don't know how it's going to turn out. And so it becomes vital for us to do what we can to ensure that it will ultimately turn out for the better. And that's possible. We just have to understand our stake in the game. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and so we can see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Professor Warren. Let me start off with a question that picks up on what you were talking about near the end, that anxious time, that uncertainty of not knowing how things are going to turn out. And you've shared with us just a heartbreaking reminder of the stereotypes of race, and you talked about the polarization that we're facing now. So let me put you on the spot a little bit and ask, are you optimistic or pessimistic at this point in time?
I've always been a glass half full type of person, you know, and so I have optimism, sort of optimism wrapped up in realism. um, uh, um, you know, and part of it is that you know, when you consider the alternative, you know, it's just too hard to think about. You know, I have to be optimistic because that energizes me to take steps, knowing that there is hope, that things can be turned, things can be turned to the better.
Perhaps you could end sharing your screen.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
So following up on that same question, that quotation that was there, I guess we should have stayed with it for a moment so we could see it. It is when things are at their worst that you actually have the best chance to succeed. And one observer asks, so are things at their worst? And if not, can you really name an era where things were that much better?
I'm sorry, what was that last thing? The last thing you said?
Can you, if things are not at their worst, well, when has it been worse, I guess? I mean, has it ever been better?
You know, in my life, and I'm I'm 70 years old, you know, which still blows my mind to think about it. But I guess I've never seen things the way they are now. You know, I have to, you know, I think back and think, you know, have we always been this divided? And I know that there have been divisions in our society. You know, it's just the nature of a democracy. But I can't recall a situation in which, like, Congress was at a deadlock for the length of time that it has been at a deadlock. That there does not appear to be you know, much bipartisan efforts taking place, where people come together with different perspectives and try to identify what they have in common, and try to come up with a compromise that allow us to establish policies that are beneficial to our nation. You know, it does seem to be very. It does seem to be a very, very difficult time, more difficult than I've ever experienced. But again, I think you see that people's eyes are open. I mean, you know, when they used to talk about the silent majority, you know, you see people are recognizing the situation that we are in and stating that that's not what they want. This is not the nation that they believe in, and are expressing. I guess when I talk about people having skin in the game, uh, uh, you know, the perception that I have is that many people do, more so than what I've experienced in my life, and I draw hope from that. That people um, do feel that this is not a place, this is not a society, this is not a country um, that uh, that they want for themselves and their families.
Let me ask you a question about partisan politics. And you're talking about stereotypes. You looked at social stereotypes and the cultural, but then you also showed us about the use of dog whistles in political campaigns, and the racial divide is reflected in our partisan politics. Black Americans vote for Democrats by about 90%, and white Americans in recent elections vote for Republicans by about 2/3. Is there any hope for bridging that partisan divide and so that it doesn't reflect so much the racial divides in our country as well?
Well, I think that if we have leaders who are truly devoted to um, to making our society work, making our institutions work in a way that's it's I guess it's the nature of politics to always want to be the party in charge, and a certain amount of gamesmanship you can expect. That's just the nature of a democracy. But you do want to have leaders who are willing to work on bridging the gaps between the different parties, and uh, and and engage in dialogue, engage in negotiation, without fearing that their political life is going to come to an end if they reach across and try to work in a bipartisan sort of way. But even more important than national politics is the politics that goes on at home. And what's really interesting to me is, I live in a semi-rural area, and while there might have been gridlock in Washington on the local town boards, um, you know, those boards were able to work together, and sometimes with in consensus with one another, despite their own different political affiliations, because someone has to fill the potholes. Someone has to um, uh, take care of the local issues that are affecting people where they live. So you can see that it can get done, but I'm just hoping that people are fed up enough with the gridlock and the divisiveness, the toxic divisiveness, that there will be change coming.
So let me ask a question about the negative influence of religious faith, and to what extent religious doctrine has historically perpetuated racist ideas that then ultimately became part of legal theories and legal doctrines.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think this is a part of our history that we have to acknowledge when we are looking at the sources and perpetuators of the adverse stereotypes, for example. Um, the church, while it might be have at its base, our spiritual relationship with God,
is that we are, it is a human institution on Earth, made up of human beings, and sadly enough, can be influenced by the politics of the day. I think that we have to, just as in all of our institutions, go in with eyes open and not just simply allowing someone else to tell us what we think, or what we should do. We should analyze for ourselves what's going on, you know, and seek to make a difference within those institutions, including the church, to make sure that they are not engaged in inhumane or discriminatory practices.
We have several questions about the role of repentance. You spoke about the sickness of the soul that racism brings, the sin of racism. What role should repentance play here? That is, publicly repenting for the sins of the past, and also looking, as Jeremiah wrote, that my heart is wicked and I need the intervention of God to change my heart.
I think that repentance and forgiveness are very important. You look at how other societies have dealt with the problems concerning race and the histories of oppression. You look at South Africa. I mean, I've always been curious about their Truth and Reconciliation commissions, where their approach was to have people come forward and know that they can be forgiven, I guess, to use that term. If they acknowledge what they had done. And it would be interesting to see an analysis as to how successful that was in relieving the divisiveness that had occurred in that society under apartheid. But it was obviously based on a notion of repentance and forgiveness.
What is more important, or should be the first priority? Winning the hearts and minds, that is changing people's souls, as we've been talking about, or establishing policies and laws? Changing hearts and minds is a difficult long-term process. Can we actually accomplish more by pushing for changes in conditions that build trust and sharing of power?
Well, I mean, all of the above. I think that, the whole discussion about how do we change hearts and minds, is part of a reflection on where are we as a society in achieving equal opportunity and equality within our society. And to a certain extent, integration is viewed as the ultimate test of whether we can truly have equality. But on the other hand, regardless of how far or near we are to achieving equality, there are needs within our community. There are injustices that are occurring that we have to address. There are issues concerning resources that have been unjustly
denied or inadequately provided for, that has to be corrected. You know, so this, all of the above is the answer that I would give. That yes, we have to address the inequities in our society on an ongoing basis. We have to make our demands concerning what is just. But how close we are to being achieving true equality, even in those areas that are measured by the heart, that is another need that we have to address.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of education, which of course is precisely what you were doing today, and we're all of course involved in this educational enterprise. But education about the history of America and bringing people face to face with the shocking and just disgusting historical examples that you provided. What is there a way that we can integrate more of that understanding into our American education system?
Oh, well, definitely, and I think that's it's just it's almost shocking when you look at some like survey textbooks, especially on history, that omit so much. It's I think having a true understanding of what where we have been as a society, how we have evolved, is critical to being able to effectively improve our society. But sometimes it's just shocking when you consider how much is omitted, or how things are described.
And as a final question, what can we do individually, collectively, at this point in time? What are some actions that we can take? And in particular, being a professor in the law school, what opportunities are there for law students to become involved in overcoming these racist stereotypes?
Well, I believe that, especially for those who are in the majority culture, don't tolerate discrimination. Don't tolerate stereotypes. Call people who feel free to express such things in your presence. Let them know that it's not welcome. It's interesting how in some situations, people who would not reveal their racist perspectives feel comfortable doing so when they believe that they are with other people who are of their same race or whatever. But if a person were to be challenged in a situation like that, it would make a difference. It would indicate that you are not, you don't accept that perspective, and it would make a difference. Also, I think it's very important to understand that your what you perceive to be reality is not the reality for everyone, and to take it upon yourself to educate yourself as to what's really going on. educate yourself on the issues of the day that affect race relations. And like I said, to understand that you do have, that this is something that affects you and is not just something that you're observing as an outsider, that it is vital to you.
Thank you so very much. We've gone a little past the 1 hour mark, and I hate to cut it short even now, but thank you so much for staying with us. Thank you so much, Professor Warren, for sharing with us. And we look forward to seeing all of you again at future Murphy Institute programs. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.